The galaxy had been burning for 200 years, and Earth had done nothing about it. Not because humans were weak, and not because they did not care, but because they had made a choice long ago, a choice that the rest of the galaxy could never understand. Ambassador Lena Vasquez stood at the center of the Galactic Forum on Neutral Station Pariah 9, surrounded by representatives from over 300 species, and she could feel every single pair of alien eyes staring at her with something between disgust and amusement. She had come here to do what she always did, remind the galaxy that Earth wanted no part in their war. The Terran Accord reaffirms its position of complete neutrality, she said into the voice amplifier, keeping her tone calm and steady. We offer humanitarian aid to all sides, we open our medical stations to any wounded, and we ask only to be left in peace. The laughter came immediately. It started from the Valith section of the forum, where the tall insectoid delegates clicked their mandibles together in what passed for mockery among their kind, and it spread quickly through the chamber like a disease. The coward species speaks again, hissed Delegate Vran of the Valith Dominion, his forearms folded across his armored chest. Hiding behind your little blue planet while the galaxy decides its future. You are not neutral, Ambassador. You are irrelevant. Lena did not flinch because she had heard these words 1,000 times before, and they had stopped hurting a long time ago. Even the Orin Collective, the side that was supposed to represent freedom and cooperation, looked at her with barely hidden contempt. With respect, Ambassador, said the Orin representative, a tall feathered being named Counselor Mavan. Neutrality in the face of tyranny is not a virtue, it is a surrender. Lena wanted to argue, wanted to tell them all that they were wrong. Clear? And so she simply bowed her head and returned to her seat, while the forum moved on to other matters. She sat there in silence and thought about her grandmother, Chancellor Elena Vasquez, the woman who had written the doctrine that still guided Earth 2 centuries later. The Vasquez doctrine was simple, and every human child learned it in school. We will not fire the first shot, we will not fire the second, but God help anyone who forces us to fire the third. Most aliens who heard it thought it was a joke, the empty threat of a species too afraid to fight. They had no idea how wrong they were. Thousands of light years away from the forum, in a secure command center buried deep beneath the Swiss Alps on Earth, Commander Rhys Okafor sat in front of a wall of holographic screens and frowned at what he was seeing. Rhys was the head of Terran intelligence, a quiet man with sharp eyes and a mind that never stopped working. And right now, his mind was telling him that something very bad was about to happen. The data was clear, even if nobody else wanted to see it. The Valith Dominion was losing the war. After 2 centuries of grinding conflict, the Insectoid Empire was running out of ships, running out of soldiers, and running out of time, and their leadership, the Hive generals who answered to the mysterious Supreme Overmind, was growing desperate. Desperate empires did dangerous things, and Rhys had spent his entire career studying exactly what kind of dangerous things they did. He pulled up a report from one of his deep cover agents inside Valith space, and read the words that made his stomach drop. High-level chatter indicates strategic interest in Sol system. Target classified as low risk, high reward for morale purposes. Low risk. That was what the Valith thought about Earth. A soft target, an easy victory, a coward species hiding behind a modest defense fleet that would crumble at the first sign of real force. Rhys closed the report and immediately requested a meeting with Chancellor Marin Idris. Chancellor Idris was a woman of 63 years, with gray hair she kept short and dark eyes that had seen more crisis meetings than she cared to remember. And when Rhys walked into her office, she could tell from his face that this was not going to be a normal briefing. "How bad is it?" she asked, before he even sat down. "The Valith are looking at us," Rhys said, placing a data tablet on her desk. "They are losing the war, and they need a quick win to keep their swarms motivated, and we are the easiest target in the galaxy, at least in their minds. Idris picked up the tablet and read through the intelligence in silence, her face revealing nothing. "They think we are weak," she said finally. "Everyone thinks we are weak, Chancellor," Reese replied. "We have spent 200 years making sure of that no one outside of Earth's highest security clearance knew. For 2 centuries, while the galaxy fought and bled and burned, humanity had been doing something extraordinary. They had been preparing. Not preparing to conquer, not preparing to expand, but preparing for the single, terrible possibility that someone would be foolish enough to bring the war to their door. The project was called Porcupine, and it was the most ambitious military engineering effort in human history. Behind the quiet face of Earth and its modest colonies, humanity had built a fortress unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Weapons platforms hidden inside asteroid fields, shipyards buried beneath the moons of Jupiter, drone factories carved into the rock of Mars, and a fleet of warships so advanced that they made the galaxy's best look like toys. All of it hidden, all of it waiting, all of it praying it would never be needed. Chancellor Idris set the tablet down and looked at Reese with those dark, tired eyes. "What do you recommend?" she asked. "We increase readiness across all Porcupine assets," he said, quietly. "No alerts, no broadcasts, nothing that shows up on anyone's sensors. But if they come, we need to be ready to respond in minutes, not hours." Idris nodded slowly, and then said something that Reese would remember for the rest of his life. "My grandmother used to say that the hardest part of being strong is letting everyone think you are weak," she said. "I hope she was right, Commander, because I am very tired of being laughed at." Far across the galaxy, in the dark heart of Valith space, Hive Admiral Sithvar stood before a massive holographic map of the Sol system, and studied it the way a predator studies wounded prey. Sithvar was considered the greatest military commander the Dominion had produced in a generation. A tall, terrifying figure covered in black chitin armor, with 6 eyes that glowed a cold amber and mandibles that could crush bone. She had conquered 11 worlds and destroyed 4 enemy fleets, and now the Supreme Overmind had given her a new mission, one that would turn the tide of the entire war. "The humans," she said to her assembled officers, her voice a low clicking rasp. "They sit in their little system, with their little ships and their little speeches about peace, and they think that makes them safe." Her second-in-command, Sub-Admiral Kethis, shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. "They have no allies," Sithvar continued, gesturing at the holographic map with one razor-tipped limb. "No one in this galaxy will come to save them. Not the Orin, not the neutral worlds, no one. They chose to stand alone, and now they will fall alone." She turned to face her officers, and every single one of them straightened under the weight of those 6 glowing eyes. "We will take 4,000 ships," she said, "a full war swarm, enough to crush anything the humans have, and we will strike their colony on Titan, destroy it completely, and broadcast the footage to every corner of the galaxy." The officers clicked their mandibles in approval. "And when the galaxy sees the coward species brought to its knees," Sithvar said, her voice rising with cold excitement, "every wavering world, every doubting hive, every species thinking of defying us will remember what happens to those who are too weak to fight." She turned back to the holographic map of Sol, and her mandibles spread in what passed for a smile among the Valith. "It will be over in a cycle," she hissed. "The humans will not even have time to scream." Sub-Admiral Kethis watched his commander's satisfaction and said nothing, but somewhere deep in his mind, in a place he would never dare show, a small voice whispered a question he could not answer. What if the humans were not as weak as everyone believed? Thought away, because doubting the Admiral was the same as doubting the Overmind, and no Valith who valued their life did that. The war swarm began to assemble in the darkness between stars, 4,000 ships of chitin and steel, forming a cloud of death that moved slowly and silently toward a small, quiet star system, where a small, quiet species waited for something they had always known would come. The attack came without warning, on a Tuesday morning, Earth Standard Time, and it came with the kind of overwhelming force that was designed not just to destroy, but to humiliate. 4,000 Valith warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a massive wave around Saturn, and within seconds they had formed a ring of death around the tiny moon of Titan, where 2 million human civilians lived and worked in a network of domed research cities beneath the orange sky. The colony's defense fleet, 40 ships, mostly patrol corvettes and a handful of aging frigates, scrambled immediately, and every single pilot knew as they launched from the orbital docks that they were flying to their deaths. Captain Yara Chen was the senior officer among them, a woman of 42 who had spent her career believing she would never see real combat. And as she looked at her tactical display and saw the 4,000 red dots surrounding her 40 blue ones settle over her, that she had only ever read about in books. "All ships, this is Captain Chen," she broadcast to her tiny fleet, her voice steady in a way that surprised even herself. "We cannot win this fight. We all know that. But we can buy time, and every second we give those people down there is a second that matters." They fought, and they fought bravely, and they bought exactly 11 minutes before the last Terran ship broke apart in a flash of light and fire. Captain Chen's corvette was the second to last to fall, and her final transmission, picked up by relay stations across the solar system, was just 4 words: "Tell Earth we tried." With the defense fleet gone, the Valith war swarm descended on Titan like a plague. Hive Admiral Sithvar had given specific orders. This was not just a military operation, it was a performance, and she wanted the entire galaxy to watch. Valith broadcast drones fanned out across the colony, capturing everything in high-definition holographic feeds that were transmitted live to every corner of known space. And what those feeds showed was horror. Dropships crashed through the domes, and thousands of Valith ground troops, massive insectoid soldiers standing 8 feet tall in biological armor, poured into the streets of the research cities, and the screaming began. They herded civilians into open plazas, and they tore down Terran flags, and they stamped their clawed feet on the ground in the rhythmic war dance that the Valith performed when they wanted their enemies to know that resistance was pointless. 14,000 people died in the first hour, crushed, shot, trampled in the panic, and the cameras captured every moment. Across the galaxy, billions of beings watched the feeds in silence, and most of them felt the same thing: a grim confirmation that neutrality had always been a death sentence for the humans. On the Orin homeworld, Counselor Mivan watched the footage and shook his feathered head sadly, muttering to his aide, "They should have joined us when they had the chance." On a dozen neutral worlds, diplomats and leaders watched and quietly began calculating how to appease the Valith. Because if this was what happened to species that stayed out of the war, then perhaps it was better to pick a side. And on Earth, in the war room beneath the Swiss Alps, Chancellor Marin Idris stood perfectly still in front of a massive display screen and watched her people die. The room around her was chaos. Generals were shouting, advisors were demanding immediate action, communication officers were trying to coordinate with colony evacuation systems, and someone, she did not see who, was crying in the corner of the room. But the Chancellor did not move, and she did not speak, and for one long and terrible minute she simply watched the screen as Valith soldiers marched through the streets of a Terran city and broadcast humiliation to the stars. Commander Reese Okafor stood 3 steps behind her, and he watched her face, and he waited, because he had known this woman for 20 years, and he knew that her silence was not weakness. It was the silence before thunder. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that only Reese and the two nearest generals heard her. "Wake up the sleepers." Reese felt a chill run down his spine, not from fear, but from the weight of what those words meant, and he immediately turned to the senior communications officer and repeated the command in a voice that cut through all the noise in the room like a blade. "All stations, all commands. Authorization Chancellor Priority 1. Activate Porcupine. Full deployment. No restrictions." And then the solar system began to transform. It started in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, where 300 rocks that had been catalogued by galactic surveys as dead, worthless space debris suddenly cracked open along invisible seams. And from inside each one emerged warships. Real warships, heavy cruisers and battleships and carriers that had been built in secret over decades and hidden inside hollowed-out asteroids where no one would ever think to look. Around Jupiter, the 4 largest moons lit up like small suns as buried power plants came online for the first time, feeding energy into weapons platforms that rose from beneath the ice and rock, platforms the size of cities, carrying weapons that had no name in any galactic language, because humanity had invented them specifically for this moment. Mars erupted, and that was the only word for it. Thousands of launch silos opened across the red planet's surface and vomited swarms of autonomous combat drones into the sky, each one small and fast and carrying enough firepower to gut a Valith destroyer. From hidden bases on Europa, Ganymede, Callisto, and a dozen other moons, fleet after fleet of Terran warships launched in perfect formation, their hulls painted the deep black of space, and their engines burning with a blue fire that the Valith had never seen before. And in Earth orbit, the final and most terrifying layer of Project Porcupine revealed itself, the Sol Defense Grid, a network of 12,000 interlocking weapons satellites, kinetic kill platforms, and gravity well generators that turned the space around humanity's homeworld into a killing field that nothing could cross. The quiet planet had never been quiet at all. It had been a trap that no one was ever supposed to spring, built by a species that had spent 2 centuries praying that it would never be needed, and now it was awake, and it was angry. Commander Reese Okafor boarded his flagship, the Tan Resolve, at the head of a fast attack flotilla of 200 ships, and within minutes he was burning towards Saturn at speeds that would have made Valith engineers weep with envy. As his fleet crossed the orbit of Jupiter, he opened a communication channel on every Valith military frequency. Every single one, including the encrypted ones that the Valith thought no one else could access. And he broadcast a message that would be replayed in history classes for centuries to come. "This is Commander Reese Okafor of the Terran Accord Navy, broadcasting to all Valith forces in the Saturn Theater." He paused, and in that pause, every Valith ship in orbit around Titan received the transmission and went silent. "You have attacked a civilian colony of the Terran Accord without provocation or declaration of war," he continued, his voice carrying the calm and measured tone of a man who had already done the math and knew exactly how this was going to end. "You have killed our people, and you have broadcast their deaths for entertainment." Another pause, and across Titan, Valith ground commanders looked up at him, the sky as their communication officers scrambled to trace the signal. "You now have 60 minutes to release all civilian hostages, cease all hostile operations, and begin withdrawal from Terran space," Reese said. "This is not a negotiation, and this is not a request. This is a countdown, and when it reaches 0, you will learn why Earth stayed out of your war." He closed the channel and leaned back in his command chair, and his first officer, Lieutenant Commander Priya Sharma, looked at him with wide eyes. "Commander," she said quietly, "do you think they will actually withdraw?" Reese shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "they will not, but I needed to give them the chance, because when the history of this day is written, I want it to be absolutely clear that we gave them every opportunity to walk away." On the surface of Titan, Hive Admiral Sitvar received the transmission in her mobile command center, and burst into a clicking, hissing laugh. That made her officers flinch. 60 minutes, she repeated, her 6 amber eyes gleaming with amusement. The cowards give us 60 minutes, as if they have anything behind those words, except more words. She turned to her communications officer and ordered the message replayed on the galactic broadcast, so that every being in the galaxy could hear the humans making empty threats. And she laughed again, and her officers laughed with her, because the idea that 40 ships, 40, could challenge a war swarm of 4,000 was the funniest thing any of them had ever heard. But Sub-Admiral Kethis was not laughing. He was standing at the sensor station, and he was staring at the tactical display with an expression that, if he had been human, would have been called pure terror. "Admiral," he said, and something in his voice made Sithvar stop laughing. "What is it?" she snapped. Kethis turned the tactical display so she could see it, and for the first time in her career, Hive Admiral Sithvar had nothing to say. The display showed the space between Jupiter and Saturn, and it was filling with contacts. Blue contacts, Terran contacts, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands upon thousands of them, pouring out of hiding places across the solar system in a flood of ships and drones and weapons platforms that grew larger with every passing second. "Admiral," Kethis said, his voice barely above a whisper, "where did all these ships come from?" Sithvar stared at the display, and the clicking sound her mandibles made was no longer laughter. It was the sound the Valith made when they were afraid. The countdown had begun, and somewhere out there in the dark between worlds, Commander Okafor watched the clock and waited. And behind him, the full might of a species that had spent 2 centuries preparing for this exact moment was moving into position like the closing of a fist. The coward species was done being quiet. The 60 minutes ran out at exactly 1400 Earth Standard Time, and the Valith had not moved a single ship. Hive Admiral Sithvar had spent that hour trying to convince herself that the sensor readings were wrong, that the thousands of Terran ships flooding her displays were ghosts or tricks or some kind of electronic warfare. Anything except what they actually were. But deep down, in the ancient survival instincts that even 2,000 years of Valith civilization could not erase, she already knew the truth. She had kicked open a door that should have stayed closed. Commander Reese Okafor sat in the command chair of the Tan Resolve and watched the countdown reach 0, and when it did, he felt nothing. No excitement, no rage, no satisfaction. Just a heavy, tired sense of duty that sat on his shoulders, like a weight he would carry for the rest of his life. "All Terran forces," he said into the fleet-wide channel. "Weapons free. Engage all hostile targets. Protect civilian zones. Minimize collateral where possible." He paused, and then added 5 words that were not in any official protocol, but that every human in the fleet understood. "Bring our people home safe." What happened next was not a battle. The galaxy had watched wars for 2 centuries, massive, grinding, brutal slugfests where fleets smashed into each other like waves crashing against rocks, where victory was measured in how many ships you could afford to lose before the other side lost more. This was not that. This was something the galaxy had never seen before, and it would change the way every species thought about war forever. The Terran fleet numbered over 12,000 ships, outnumbering the Valith war swarm 3-1. But the numbers were almost beside the point. It was the way the humans fought that shattered everything the galaxy thought it knew about combat. The Valith had always fought as a swarm. Thousands of ships, moving in massive formations, guided by the psychic will of their hive commanders. Overwhelming enemies through sheer numbers and ferocity. And for 200 years, this strategy had worked against every species they faced. Against humanity, it lasted about 4 minutes. The Terran ships did not fly in formations. They moved in fluid, constantly shifting patterns that seemed chaotic, until you realized that every single movement was coordinated by a network of warfare AI systems so advanced that they could predict what the Valith were going to do before the Valith themselves knew. When a Valith squadron turned left, Terran ships were already there waiting for them. And when the swarm tried to regroup, human electronic warfare systems jammed their psychic communication relays and turned their greatest strength, their hive coordination, into their greatest weakness. Suddenly, Valith captains who had never made an independent decision in their lives were alone in their own heads, cut off from the hive mind, and they panicked. Human weapons technology was another shock entirely. The galaxy fought with plasma cannons and kinetic slugs, proven, reliable, boring. But humanity had spent 2 centuries in isolation, doing what humans did best. They had innovated. Terran ships carried directed energy weapons that could slice through Valith bioarmor like it was paper, guided torpedoes that could chase a target through an asteroid field and hit a specific system on a specific deck of a specific ship, and most terrifying of all, gravitic lances that could create tiny, focused gravity wells inside an enemy vessel, crushing critical systems from within, without ever breaching the hull. It was precise, it was surgical, and it was devastatingly effective. The galactic broadcast that Sithvar had set up to show humanity's humiliation was still running, and now billions of beings across the galaxy were watching something very different from what the Valith had promised. They were watching the most feared military force in the galaxy being taken apart like a child's toy by a species everyone had called cowards. On the Orin homeworld, Counselor Mivon stood in front of a screen, with his beak hanging open, unable to speak, and his aide had to tap him 3 times before he responded. How was all he could say. How did they build all of this without anyone knowing? On neutral worlds across the galaxy, leaders who had been preparing to appease the Valith quietly shelved those plans and began placing very nervous calls to their military advisors. And in the Valith High Command, far away in the heart of the Dominion, generals who had approved Sithvar's mission began the quiet, cowardly process of preparing to blame everything on her. Above Titan, the battle, if it could even be called that, raged on, and Sithvar watched her war swarm dissolve. Around her, with the horrified disbelief of someone watching their house burn down, ship after ship fell, not in the massive explosions that Valith warfare usually produced, but in the quiet, efficient way that humans seem to prefer. Engines disabled, weapons destroyed, life support left intact. They were not trying to kill her crews, she realized with a shock that cut through her fury like ice water. They were trying to capture them. They fight like no one I have ever seen, Sub-Admiral Kethis said from beside her, and his voice held something she had never heard from him before. Respect. They could destroy every ship in our swarm, and instead they are taking them apart piece by piece. It is weakness, Sithvar snarled, but even she did not believe the words as they left her mouth. After 3 hours of combat, the war swarm of 4,000 ships had been reduced to 800 functional vessels, and Sithvar knew with absolute certainty that the battle was lost. Not just lost, but lost in a way that would echo through Valith history for generations. But she was a Hive Admiral of the Valith Dominion, and she had never surrendered, and she would not start now. All remaining ships, form on my flagship, she commanded, her voice hard and bright with the terrible energy of someone who has decided to die. We break through their lines and make for Earth itself. If we are going to fall, we fall on the enemy's homeworld. Kethis looked at her with something close to pity, but said nothing, because orders were orders, and the 800 remaining Valith ships formed a tight spear formation around Sithvar's massive flagship, and drove straight toward the inner solar system at maximum speed. Rhys Okafor watched the Valith formation on his tactical display, and felt a grudging respect for the alien admiral. She was beaten, she knew it, and she was choosing to go down fighting, rather than. He could understand that, even if he wished she had made a different choice. "All ships, pursue but do not overcommit," he ordered. "Let the Sol defense grid handle this. That is what it was built for." Sithvar's 800 ships screamed past the orbit of Jupiter and into the inner solar system, and for a brief moment, it looked like they might actually reach Earth. And on the surface of the blue planet, millions of people looked up at the sky and held their breath. Then the Sol defense grid activated, and hope died for the Valith. The grid was not a wall. It was a web, a layered, interlocking nightmare of weapon systems that stretched across millions of kilometers and left no path unguarded. First came the kinetic kill platforms, which launched clouds of tungsten rods at incredible speeds, and the Valith frontline ships disintegrated as millions of metal fragments shredded through their hulls. Then came the directed energy. Batteries. Massive orbital installations that fired beams of focused light so powerful they could cut a battleship in half from 100,000 kilometers away, and more Valith ships died. Then came the gravity traps, hidden generators that created sudden, intense gravity wells in the Valith's path, and ships that were moving at combat speed suddenly found themselves being crushed by forces they could not see or escape. And finally came the hunter-killer swarms, millions of tiny autonomous drones that poured from hidden stations like angry hornets and swarmed over the remaining Valith ships, crawling across their hulls and cutting through armor with plasma torches, until the ships were nothing but drifting, helpless wrecks. In 22 minutes, Sithvar's desperate charge was over. Her flagship drifted in space, engines dead, weapons destroyed, life support running on backup power, and she stood on her darkened bridge, surrounded by the bodies of her fallen officers, and waited for the humans to come and finish her. But they did not finish her. Instead, Commander Okafor's voice came through on her emergency communication channel, calm and almost gentle. "Hive Admiral Sithvar, your fleet is destroyed, and your ship is disabled. You and your surviving crew will be taken aboard Terran vessels and treated as prisoners of war under the full protections of the Terran Accord's humanitarian codes. You will not be harmed." Sithvar closed her 6 eyes and felt something she had never felt before. Not just defeat, but confusion, because in all her years of war, no enemy had ever offered mercy after what she had done. On Earth, as Terran Marines boarded the Valith flagship and carefully, professionally secured its crew without killing a single one, Ambassador Lena Vasquez walked to a communication terminal and requested an emergency session of the Galactic Forum. When the Forum connected, faster than had ever assembled before, because every species in the galaxy was desperate to hear what the humans would say. Lena did not give a speech. She held up a single holographic image, a photograph of a street on Titan, covered in dust and debris, where the bodies of human civilians lay in rows, men, women, and children who had been alive that morning, and were now dead because a Hive Admiral had decided they were easy targets. 14,000, Lena said, and her voice was steady but heavy with a grief that needed no translation. 14,000 of our people, scientists, teachers, engineers, children, killed in the first hour of an attack we did nothing to provoke. She looked directly into the camera, and every being watching felt the weight of her gaze. "We wanted peace," she said. "We spent 200 years building a quiet life, asking nothing from any of you except to be left alone. You laughed at us. You called us cowards, murdered our families in their homes." She set the image down and straightened her back. "Now you will see what our peace cost us to build," she said, "and you will understand that we were never cowards. We were patient, and our patience has just run out." The Forum was silent, completely, absolutely silent, for the first time in its 300-year history. And across the galaxy, from the great halls of the Orin Collective to the deepest hive warrens of the Valith Dominion, a single thought passed through every mind, spoken in 1,000 languages, but meaning the same thing. They should not have touched the quiet ones. The galaxy changed overnight, and everyone felt it. In the 48 hours following the Battle of Titan, the Valith Dominion lost more than a war swarm. They lost the myth that had kept their empire together for 2 centuries. The myth that they were unbeatable, that resistance was suicide, and that the swarm would always devour everything in its path. That myth died above Saturn, broadcast live for the entire galaxy to watch, and its death set fires burning across every corner of Valith space. On the industrial world of Kreth 4, where Valith overseers had forced a reptilian species called the Sithar to build warships for generations, the factory workers stopped working, looked at each other, and then looked at the guards, and for the first time in living memory, the guards looked away first. On the mining colonies of the Dust Reach, 3 different enslaved species rose up in the same week, overwhelming their Valith garrisons with sheer numbers and fury. And when the Dominion tried to send reinforcement fleets, they found that those fleets were needed elsewhere, because everything was falling apart at once. The Valith Dominion was cracking, and everyone could hear it. In the Orin Collective, the mood was something between hope and terror. Hope, because their ancient enemy was weakening faster than anyone had dreamed possible. And terror, because the species that had broken the Valith was an unknown factor that the Orin could not predict or control. Counselor Mivan stood before the Orin High Council and delivered a report that he had stayed up all night preparing, and the core of it was simple. We have spent 2 centuries fighting the Valith and making no progress, and the humans dismantled an entire war swarm in 6 hours. We need to decide very quickly whether we want them as allies or whether we would rather hope they go back to sleep. The council debated for 3 days, which was fast by their standards. And in the end, they made a decision that would shape the future of the galaxy. They sent their most respected diplomat to Earth. Elder Tivas of the Faloran was ancient even by the standards of a species that measured lifespans in centuries. A towering, tree-like being whose bark skin was covered in luminescent moss and whose voice sounded like wind moving through a deep forest. He had negotiated peace treaties between species that had been at war for longer than humanity had existed, and he had seen empires rise and fall. And when the Orin Council asked him to go to Earth and speak to the humans, he agreed immediately, because for the first time in a very long time, he was curious. His ship arrived in the Sol system and was escorted, politely but firmly, through 3 separate security checkpoints before being allowed to approach Earth. And at each checkpoint, Tivas noted the weapons platforms, the drone patrols, and the quiet efficiency of the Terran military with a respect that grew deeper with every passing minute. He was received in Geneva by Chancellor Marin Idris herself, along with Ambassador Vasquez and Commander Okafor, and the 4 of them sat together in a simple meeting room with large windows that looked out over a green valley where children were playing in a park. Tivas noticed the children, and he noticed that Idris had chosen this room deliberately. She wanted him to see what they were protecting, not what they were capable of destroying. "I will not waste your time with flattery, Chancellor," Tivas said, his deep voice filling the room like the sound of a slow river. "The Orin Collective has watched the footage from Titan many times, and we have come to 2 conclusions." Idris nodded for him to continue. "First, that we were fools to ever dismiss your species as irrelevant," he said, "and second, that you are the most dangerous civilization in this galaxy, and the fact that you have chosen to be gentle makes you more frightening, not less." Idris allowed herself a small, tired smile. "We did not build all of this to be frightening, Elder," she said. "We built it so we would never have to be frightened." Tivas studied her face for a long moment, his ancient eyes reading something in her expression that went deeper than words. "I have not come to beg for an alliance," he said, The Orin have begged before, and it has never served us well. Instead, I have come to tell you something that I believe you need to hear. Go ahead, Idris said. In 400 years of war, Tavas said slowly, I have seen species fight with rage, with hunger, with religious fire, and with cold calculation. But I have never, in all my centuries, seen a species fight the way you do. He leaned forward, and the moss on his bark skin glowed a soft blue. You fight with reluctance, he said. Every weapon you fired, every ship you destroyed, you did it with sadness. I could see it in the way your commanders gave orders, in the way your soldiers boarded enemy ships without cruelty, in the way your ambassador wept while delivering a message of strength. He paused, and the room was very still. That is why you terrify them, he said. Not because you are powerful, the galaxy has seen powerful before, but because you do not want to be. And a species that fights only when it must, and grieves every time it does, is a species that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be bribed, and cannot be stopped. He straightened and looked directly at Idris, with eyes that had seen civilizations born and die. That is why you should lead, he said, not because you want to, but precisely because you do not. The room was silent for a long time after Tivas finished speaking, and Idris looked at Vasquez, and Vasquez looked at Okafor, and all three of them felt the weight of a decision that was bigger than any of them. If we enter this war, Idris said carefully, if we commit the full strength of the Terran Accord to ending this conflict, what happens after? Do we become the next empire? Do we trade one tyrant for another? That, Tivaz said, is entirely up to you. Chancellor Idris did not make the decision alone, and she did not make it quickly, because she understood something that many leaders in the galaxy did not. That the most dangerous moment for any civilization is not when it is weak, but when it is strong enough to do whatever it wants. She went before the Terran Senate, and the Senate debated for a week, and the debate was fierce and honest, and sometimes painful in the way that only democratic arguments can be. Commander Okafor spoke for intervention, and he did not hide behind comfortable words. They will come back, he said, standing at the podium in his uniform, with the weight of Titan's dead behind every word. The Valith are weakened, but they are not destroyed, and weakened predators are the most dangerous kind. If we return to isolation now, if we close our eyes and pretend this is over, we will fight this same war again in 20 years, or 50, or 100, and next time the dead will not number in the thousands, but in the millions. Ambassador Vasquez spoke for caution, and she was equally honest. If we go out there with our fleets, and our weapons, and our righteous anger, we will win, she said. I have no doubt about that. But what do we become in the process? Every empire in history started with a just cause, and ended with a crown. And I did not survive Titan to watch humanity become the thing we fought against. The Senate listened, and argued, and then did something that stunned the galaxy when word of it leaked out. They put it to a vote, not of the Senate, but of every single Terran citizen across every colony, station, and outpost in human space. For 3 days, humanity voted, and the galaxy watched in confusion, because most species could not comprehend the idea of asking ordinary people to decide questions of war and peace. The result came in on a Sunday evening, 61% in favor of intervention, with a mandate that was written into the official resolution in language so clear that no future leader could twist it. The Terran Accord will commit its military forces to the ending of the Galactic War and the liberation of all species enslaved by the Valith Dominion, upon the conclusion of hostilities. All Terran forces will withdraw to Terran space. No territory will be claimed, no governments will be installed, and the freed peoples of the galaxy will determine their own futures without Terran interference. It was the most human thing imaginable, a species voting to go to war, and in the same breath, voting to come home when it was over. Chancellor Idris authorized the deployment, and Ambassador Vasquez was given one final task before the guns began firing again. She was to go before the Galactic Forum and deliver humanity's terms. She stood at the same podium where she had been laughed at for years, and she looked out at the representatives of 300 species, and this time nobody was laughing. "The Terran Accord has voted," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a species that had found its resolve. "We are entering this war, not for territory, not for power, and not for revenge, but because 2 million of our people were attacked without cause and 14,000 of them are dead. And because we have seen what the Valith Dominion does to those who cannot defend themselves." She placed a data tablet on the podium. "These are our terms. The Valith Dominion will release all conquered worlds, disarm its war swarms, and submit its leadership to a galactic tribunal for crimes against sentient life. The Dominion has 30 standard days to accept these terms." The Valith representative, a nervous, low-ranking diplomat who had been abandoned by his superiors, rose from his seat and shouted with more courage than sense, "The Dominion will never bow to mammals. You will burn, human. Every last one of you will burn." Vasquez looked at him, and her expression held no anger, only a deep and weary sadness. "We have been on fire before," she said quietly. "It did not destroy us. It forged us, and your masters are about to learn the difference." She stepped down from the podium, and the forum erupted into chaos, but she did not look back. Far across the galaxy, in the deepest chamber of the Valith throne world, something ancient stirred. The Supreme Overmind had not moved in a century. It did not need to, because its psychic tendrils reached across the entire Dominion, guiding its hive generals and directing its swarms from a throne of living chitin in a cavern so vast that it had its own weather. But now it opened its 1,000 eyes, and it reached out with its mind, and it touched the thoughts of every Valith in the galaxy, and they all felt the same thing at the same time, a cold, creeping sensation that started in the back of their minds, and spread through their bodies like ice water. The Overmind was afraid. It had ruled for 1,000 years. It had crushed 100 species. It had bent the galaxy to its will through force and terror and the unshakable belief that nothing in the universe was stronger than the swarm. And now, for the first time, it looked toward a small yellow star at the edge of the galaxy and felt something it could not name. A feeling that the tiny, soft, fragile creatures who lived around that star were coming for it, and that all its power, all its swarms, all its centuries of dominion would not be enough to stop them. A human would have called it fear. The Overmind called it nothing, because it had no word for something it had never felt before. But it felt it all the same, and in the dark of its ancient chamber, the most powerful being in the galaxy shuddered. The 30 days passed, and the Valith Dominion gave no answer, which was an answer in itself. On the 31st day, the Terran Accord launched Operation Homecoming, and the galaxy learned one final truth about humanity. They were just as terrifying on the attack as they were on defense. The campaign was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed, not because of its scale, though its scale was enormous, but because of the way it was fought. Human commanders were placed in key strategic positions across the Allied fleet. A combined force of Terran, Oran, and Rebel species ships that numbered in the tens of thousands. And within the first week, the difference was obvious to everyone. The Oran had been fighting the Valith for 200 years, using strategies that were brave, honorable, and almost completely ineffective, throwing fleets at fortified positions in head-on assaults that cost millions of lives and gained a handful of systems. Humans looked at those strategies and politely suggested a different approach. Commander Okafor, now promoted to Fleet Admiral for the duration of the campaign, sat in a war room aboard the Tan Resolve and laid out his plan for the Orin commanders with a patience that surprised even his own officers. "You have been fighting the swarm as a swarm," he said, pointing at a holographic map of Valith space. "Meeting their strength with your strength, their numbers with your numbers. And that is exactly what they want you to do, because the Valith are built for attrition, and you are not." He traced a line through the map that cut through empty space, far from any Valith stronghold. "We do not attack their fleets," he said. "We attack their supply lines, their communication relays, and their psychic amplifier stations. We cut the strings, and the puppets fall on their own." The Orin commanders were skeptical, because this was not how honorable war was fought in the galaxy, but they agreed to try, and within 2 weeks, they understood why humanity had never lost a war it had actually committed to fighting. Valith fortress systems that had held for decades fell in days, not because the Terran-led forces overwhelmed them, but because they arrived to find the garrisons already starving, already cut off, already confused and leaderless, because the psychic relays connecting them to the Overmind had been quietly destroyed by Terran stealth ships weeks earlier. But it was not the military efficiency that shocked the galaxy the most. It was the mercy. On every world they liberated, on every ship they captured, the humans did something that no one in 200 years of galactic war had ever done. They treated the enemy like people. Valith prisoners were given food, medical treatment, and shelter, and when Orin soldiers who had lost families to the Valith protested, Okafor gathered them together and explained it in words so simple that they cut through centuries of hatred like light through darkness. "We are not fighting to destroy them," he said. "We are fighting so that when this is over, we can all stop fighting. And if we treat them like monsters, then we become monsters, and this war never truly ends." Some of the Orin understood, and some did not. But they followed the rules because the humans asked them to, and because deep down they knew that the humans were right. The campaign swept across Valith space like a rising tide, and as it advanced, something extraordinary began to happen. Valith soldiers, drones who had been psychically controlled by their hive commanders for their entire lives, started surrendering voluntarily, not because they were beaten, but because word had spread through the ranks about how the humans treated prisoners. And for creatures who had only ever known the Overmind's iron will, the idea of being treated with kindness was more powerful than any. Hive Admiral Sibvar, still a prisoner aboard a Terran ship, watched the campaign unfold from her cell with a mixture of shame and wonder. And one evening, she asked her guard, a young Terran Marine named Corporal David Achebe, a question that had been eating at her since the Battle of Titan. "Why did you not kill me?" she asked, her 6 eyes studying his face with genuine confusion. "I attacked your civilians. I murdered your people. By every law of war in the galaxy, you had the right to execute me, and instead you gave me a bed and 3 meals a day." David looked at her for a long moment, and then he said something that Sidvar would carry with her for the rest of her very long life. "Because killing you would have been easy," he said, "and the easy thing is almost never the right thing." The final battle came at Valith Prime, the ancient throne world of the Dominion, where the Supreme Overmind waited in its vast underground chamber with the last and largest swarm it could gather, 6,000 ships, crewed by soldiers whose minds it controlled directly, whose fear it suppressed, and whose rage it amplified, until they were nothing but extensions of its own murderous will. The Allied fleet, 8,000 ships strong, with a Terran core of 4,000, dropped out of faster-than-light travel in the space above Valith Prime, and for a moment the two forces hung in the void like two great beasts studying each other before the final charge. Fleet Admiral Okafor looked at the enemy formation and felt the weight of every life that had been lost since this began. The 14,000 on Titan, The millions who had died in 2 centuries of galactic war. The countless enslaved beings who had never known freedom. And he made a decision that would define humanity's legacy among the stars. "All ships, hold fire," he ordered, and the confusion on the bridge was immediate. Said, "They are forming attack formations. They will charge in minutes." "I know," Okafor said. "Patch me through to the science division. Is Project Resonance ready?" In the bowels of the Tan Resolve, a team of Terran scientists who had been working around the clock for weeks confirmed that it was. Project Resonance was not a weapon, or rather, it was not a weapon in any way the galaxy understood. Terran scientists working with data recovered from captured Valith ships and from the psychic amplifier stations they had destroyed during the campaign, had done something that should have been impossible. They had decoded the Overmind's psychic frequency, the signal it used to control its swarm, and they had built a device that could interfere with it. But they were not going to jam it, and they were not going to sever it. They were going to open it. "Activate resonance," Okafor ordered. The device fired, not a beam of light or a pulse of energy, but a wave of psychic static that washed across the Valith fleet like a wind blowing through a field of wheat, and in an instant, the Overmind's control shattered. 6,000 Valith soldiers, beings who had never in their lives experienced a thought that was entirely their own, suddenly found themselves alone in their own minds. The effect was immediate and heartbreaking. Ships stopped moving mid-charge, their pilots frozen at their controls, as unfamiliar sensations flooded through minds that had never been free. Confusion, wonder, fear, and underneath it all, a terrible, aching sadness that came from suddenly understanding, for the first time, that they had been slaves. Some ships fired wildly, their crews panicking, and the Terran fleet moved quickly to disable them, without destroying them. But most of the Valith ships simply drifted, their crews too overwhelmed by the experience of independent thought to do anything at all. Of Valith Prime, in the vast underground chamber, the supreme Overmind screamed. It was a psychic scream that echoed across light years, and every telepath in the galaxy felt it, a sound of pure rage and terror from a being that had controlled billions of minds for 1,000 years and now found itself suddenly, devastatingly alone. Chancellor Idris was patched through to a direct communication link with the Overmind's chamber, and she looked at the writhing, massive creature on her screen. A being of chitin and psychic energy the size of a building, its 1,000 eyes wild with fury, and she spoke to it calmly. "It is over," she said. The Overmind raged, its psychic energy lashing out against the dampening fields that Terran engineers had projected around its chamber, and it screamed threats and promises of destruction in a voice that shook the walls. "I have ruled for 1,000 years," it shrieked. "I have crushed species older and greater than yours. I am eternal. I am the swarm. I am—" "You are alone," Idris said, and her voice was not cruel, but it was final. "Your swarm is free. Your empire is over, and you are alone. You could have left us in peace, but you chose not to, and now here we are." The Overmind was contained in a psionic dampening field so powerful that it could not reach a single mind beyond its chamber walls, and there it would remain, not killed, because humanity did not believe in killing what could be imprisoned, but sealed away forever as a monument to what happens when absolute power meets absolute resolve. The war was over, and then humanity did the thing that the galaxy would talk about for 1,000 years afterward, the thing that confused some species, angered others, and earned the eternal respect of all. They went home. Fleet Admiral Okafor gave the order to withdraw Terran forces from every position outside the Sol system, and within 6 months, every Terran warship, every weapons platform, every forward base and supply depot had been dismantled and shipped back to human space. They did not claim a single world. They did not install a single governor. They did not demand tribute or concessions or permanent bases. They helped establish the new Galactic Council, funded reparations for the species the Valith had enslaved, contributed engineers and doctors and teachers to the rebuilding effort, and then they left. Ambassador Vasquez gave the final address at the first session of the new Galactic Council. And the chamber was full. Every species, every world, every being who could attend was there, because they all wanted to hear what the humans would say. We were asked, many times over many years, why we stayed out of your war for so long, Vasquez said, her voice carrying the calm confidence of a species that had proven itself beyond any possible doubt. The answer has always been simple. War is the worst thing a species can do to another, and we wanted no part of it. She paused and looked around the chamber at the hundreds of faces watching her. You gave us no choice, she said. You brought death to our door, and we answered it. But the war is over now, and we choose peace again, the same peace we chose 2 centuries ago, the same peace we will choose every time we are given the option. She straightened her back and delivered her final words with the kind of quiet power that needed no weapon behind it. We are going home, she said, to our blue planet, to our children, to our quiet lives. Do not make us come back. The chamber was silent, and then slowly, beginning with Elder Tavaz of the Faloran, the representatives began to stand, and they stood one by one until every being in the room was on their feet, in a silence that said more than any applause ever could. 7 years later, on a quiet colony world orbiting a gentle yellow star at the edge of human space, named Reese Okafor sat on the porch of a small wooden house and watched the sun go down over fields of golden wheat. He was 61 years old now, retired from the Navy, and his hair had gone gray at the temples, and his hands that had once commanded the most powerful fleet in galactic history, were stained with dirt from the garden he had spent the afternoon tending. A small figure came running around the corner of the house, a Valith child, barely 4 years old, with soft amber eyes and tiny mandibles that clicked happily as she ran. And she launched herself at Reese with the fearless trust that only children possess. Her name was Kira, and she had been orphaned during the final battle over Valith Prime, and Reese and his wife had adopted her because that was the kind of thing humans did. They found broken things, and they fixed them, and they found lost children, and they gave them homes. Papa Reese, Kira said, climbing into his lap and looking up at him with those big amber eyes. Tell me about the war. The other kids at school say you were a hero. Reese looked down at her, and he smiled, the kind of smile that held joy and sorrow in equal measure. And he put his arm around her small shoulders and looked out at the sunset, at the orange and gold light painting the sky above the wheat fields, at the birds flying home in the distance, at the sound of his wife laughing inside the house, and the neighbor's dog barking, and the wind moving through the grass. We did not fight because we hated them, little one, he said quietly. We fought because we loved this. He gestured at the world around them, the sunset, the quiet fields, the sound of children playing somewhere down the road, the peace that hung in the air like music. And nobody gets to take this away. Kira nestled against his chest, her mandibles clicking softly in the Valith sound that meant she felt safe. And Reese held her close and watched last light of the sun disappear below the horizon. Somewhere out among the stars, the galaxy was healing, slowly and imperfectly, the way all wounded things heal. But it was healing, and that was enough. On a porch on a quiet world, a retired admiral and his alien daughter watched the stars come out one by one, and neither of them said a word, because some moments are too perfect for words. And the galaxy, for the first time in 200 years, was at peace.